When the emperor stopped in the corridor and stared at him, the boy carrying the wine tray had no idea he'd just been sentenced to something worse than death. The year is 66 AD. The boy is maybe 13 years old. His face is delicate, his skin fair, and the emperor's dead wife looked exactly like him. 3 Roman historians documented what happened next. Suetonius, who had access to palace archives. Tacitus, Rome's greatest historian. Cassius Dio, senator and consul. All 3 recorded the same story, and all 3 struggled to find words for what it meant. They wrote about castration, public marriage, years of forced performance. But what they buried in clinical language was the calculated nature of the horror. This wasn't cruelty born of rage. This was resurrection, an emperor's attempt to bring the dead back to life by destroying the living. The boy's real name is lost. The name we have, Sporus, means seed or bastard, a mockery given after his abuse began. His voice is nowhere in the historical record. Only the machinery that destroyed him remains documented in detail. If you want to understand how power erases not just bodies but identities, hit subscribe now, because what follows is verified history that Rome tried to forget. 1 year before the boy's life ends, a woman dies screaming. Her name is Poppaea Sabina, Empress of Rome, 6 months pregnant with Nero's heir. On a spring evening in 65 AD, she argues with Nero about something trivial. He came home late from the chariot races. Nero kicks her in the abdomen. The baby dies. Poppaea hemorrhages and dies within hours. 3 sources confirm this. Suetonius says it was deliberate. Cassius Dio verifies the pregnancy and the blow. Tacitus calls it unpremeditated but lethal. Nero's public response is theater. He refuses the traditional cremation and has her body embalmed Persian style, stuffed with spices, sealed in the mausoleum of Augustus. He declares her a goddess and orders coins minted with her face crowned in divine light. Those coins sit in museums today, proof of his public grief. The private grief is different. Palace attendants report that Nero wanders halls at night calling her name. He stands before her portraits for hours, weeping, then exploding into sudden rages. Tacitus records nightmares where Poppaea's ghost appears to him, accusing. This is the man who spots a slave boy in a corridor 1 year later. The boy is carrying wine. He walks through marble hallways with steady hands and a calm face. He has no idea that in 5 minutes his life will end without his body dying. Nero stops, stares. Courtiers around him gasp. The boy's face is uncannily similar to Poppaea's. Same delicate features, same fair skin, same ethereal quality that made the empress famous. Cassius Dio uses the word uncanny. Multiple sources confirm the resemblance was striking enough to shock those who knew Poppaea. In Nero's mind, the solution forms instantly. If the boy looks like Poppaea, he can become Poppaea. All that is required is surgical intervention, imperial will, and the complete erasure of whoever this child used to be. Nero summons physicians. He gives orders. He sets in motion a machinery of transformation that will consume the next 3 years and end only when the boy chooses death over one final degradation. This is not about desire or even madness. This is about power's ultimate expression, the ability to reshape reality itself, to resurrect the dead by destroying the living. And it begins with a blade. The room where it happens is not recorded. The date is not specified. Roman historians who describe executions in graphic detail suddenly become clinical. What we know, in 67 AD, Nero orders the boy castrated. Suetonius states it plainly. He tried to turn the slave boy Sporus into a woman by cutting off his testicles. Cassius Dio confirms the procedure was performed to preserve the boy's resemblance to Poppaea by preventing male development. Roman medical texts describe the methods. Cyrenus, writing around 100 AD, details techniques including crushing the testicles to avoid hemorrhage, or complete removal of the gonads. Sometimes the penis was also removed, though sources don't specify if this was done to Sporus. There is no anesthesia in 67 AD Rome. The boy is approximately 13 years old. His screams are not in the archives. What follows the surgery is transformation more complete than physical mutilation. The recovery would take weeks, maybe months, accompanied by fever, infection risk, and pain that Roman medicine could barely address. But Nero doesn't wait for full healing. The boy is dressed in women's clothing, the stola, traditional garment of Roman matrons. He is given Poppaea's actual jewelry, her cosmetics, her perfumes. His hair is arranged in elaborate feminine styles that take hours. They rename him, not with dignity but with mockery. Sporus, from Greek sporos, meaning seed or semen. Scholar David Woods suggests it echoes Latin spurious, illegitimate child, or bastard. The name itself is violation, a constant reminder of what was done to his body and his inability to ever father children. Calvia Crispinilla, Nero's mistress, becomes the boy's wardrobe mistress, supervising his transformation into an imperial woman. Every detail is calculated, every garment chosen, every public appearance choreographed. But Nero's plan requires more than private transformation. It requires public validation. It requires the entire Roman court to participate in the fiction that Poppaea has returned from the dead. In 67 AD, during Nero's tour of Greece where he competed in Olympic Games and theatrical performances, the emperor stages a wedding ceremony. The groom is the Emperor of Rome, master of the known world. The bride is a castrated 13-year-old slave dressed as a ghost. And everyone must pretend this is normal or die. What came next was 3 years of performance. And it gets worse. The ceremony includes every element of a traditional Roman wedding. Bridal veil, red, the color of fertility and life. Dowry, witnesses from the Senate and imperial court. Torches carried in procession. Hymns sung by choruses. Everything Rome recognizes as sacred and binding. Except the bride is a castrated child and the entire empire knows it. Suetonius describes it with precision. He conducted to him before many witnesses as his wife in a proper ceremony with dowry and a red veil. The language is deliberate. This was not a private perversion but a state event. Courtiers are ordered to attend. They are ordered to bow. They are ordered to address Sporus as Augusta, the title reserved for empresses. Anyone who refuses risks the wrath of an emperor who has already murdered his mother, his first wife, his second wife, and countless senators. This is not madness. This is calculation. Nero is demonstrating that he can reshape reality itself. He can turn a boy into a woman, a slave into an empress, death into life. And everyone must agree or face execution. After the wedding, Nero treats Sporus exactly as he treated Poppaea. The boy wears the empress's gowns and jewels. He sits beside Nero at public events. He appears in gilded litters when the emperor travels. Cassius Dio records that Nero called Sporus by Poppaea's name Sabina in public and private. The Greek travel writer Pausanias documents Nero's tour and refers obliquely to his consort appearing at Olympic events. The performance is total, relentless, inescapable. Nero kisses Sporus publicly. He holds his hand at theatrical performances. He demands that senators and foreign dignitaries treat the boy with the deference due an empress of Rome. For 18 months, this continues. Day after day, night after night. A 14-year-old boy dressed as a dead woman, paraded before crowds who stare and whisper, used sexually by the emperor, and called by a ghost's name. His own voice is never recorded. His thoughts never documented. Roman law gives slaves no personhood, no rights, no escape. But June 9, 68 AD brings a change. Not freedom, something worse. Because when Nero's reign collapses, Sporus becomes valuable property in a time of chaos. And he will be passed like a trophy between men who see him as a curiosity, a political tool, and finally entertainment for a crowd. June 9, 68 AD. The Emperor of Rome is bleeding out on the floor of a suburban villa, a dagger through his throat. Nero's reign has collapsed. Military revolt led by Julius Vindex and Servius Sulpicius Galba has forced him to flee the capital. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. His Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Cassius Dio records that Sporus was present when Nero died. The boy who had been forced to play the role of the emperor's resurrected wife watched as the man who destroyed his life drove a blade into his own neck. Nero's last words, according to Suetonius, "What an artist dies in me. Even bleeding out he performs." For Sporus, Nero's death should mean freedom. It means the opposite. The year of the 4 emperors begins. In 12 months, 4 men will claim imperial purple. In that chaos, Sporus becomes valuable property. Not a person to be freed but an asset to be claimed. First comes Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who helped orchestrate Nero's fall. He seizes Sporus and treats him as his own wife, calling him Poppaea, just as Nero had. He plans to parade the boy as part of his own claim to legitimacy, a living link to Nero's reign. But Nymphidius is lynched by his own troops before coronation. Sporus passes to Helios, one of Nero's freedmen, who keeps him briefly. Then comes Emperor Otho, who rules from January to April 69 AD. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. Otho had been married to Poppaea Sabina before Nero took her and made her empress. Now he has possession of the boy who was made to resemble her. Cassius Dio writes that Otho treated Sporus kindly. What does that mean? Genuine compassion? Political calculation? A twisted sentimentality for the boy who looked like his lost wife? The sources don't say. But Otho's brief reign offers Sporus a respite from overt abuse. It doesn't last. In April 69 AD, Otho is defeated in battle and commits suicide. Sporus falls into the hands of Emperor Vitellius. And Vitellius is not kind. Suetonius's life of Vitellius catalogues his gluttony and casual brutality. Under this emperor, Sporus will face his final humiliation. And he will make a choice that historians remember 2,000 years later. Emperor Vitellius plans a spectacle for the gladiatorial arena. A theatrical reenactment of the rape of Proserpina, the mythological abduction and violation of Persephone by Hades, god of the underworld. These performances were common Roman entertainment, mixing drama with violence for crowd pleasure. Sporus will play Proserpina. A performer dressed as a satyr will publicly assault him as part of the show. Think about the layers of horror here. After being castrated at 13. After being dressed as a woman and publicly married to Nero. After 18 months of being used sexually and paraded as an empress. After being passed between 3 emperors like property. Now, at 16 years old, Sporus is scheduled for public rape as entertainment while crowds cheer. This is Rome at its darkest. Not conquest or crucifixion. Those are expected horrors of ancient warfare. This is the casual destruction of a child for amusement. The complete erasure of humanity in service of spectacle. But Sporus makes a choice. Cassius Dio records it with stark simplicity. Rather than endure the performance Vitellius planned, Sporus took his own life. The method is not specified. The location is not recorded. The exact date is unknown beyond 69 AD. We know only that 3 years after Nero first saw him in a corridor, the boy who was made into an empress chose death. He is approximately 16 years old. His entire adolescence consumed by abuse, transformation, and public humiliation. In the end, he chooses the only form of agency available to him. Death as refusal. Death as the final no to a world that treated him as property, performance, and entertainment. Suicide in Rome carries no moral stigma. The Stoics praise it as the ultimate exercise of will, proof that your soul belongs to you even when your body belongs to another. But there is something unbearably tragic about a 16-year-old choosing death as his only escape from the machinery of imperial power. No burial is recorded. No epitaph survives. No grave has been identified. The boy who was once paraded as an empress disappears from history without ceremony. Only 3 Roman historians remember to write him down, and they use his suffering to illustrate someone else's depravity. His voice remains silent, his real name lost, only the horror documented. Here is what the history books almost didn't tell you. The sources we have: Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio all wrote decades after Nero's death. Suetonius under Emperor Hadrian around 121 AD. Tacitus under Trajan around 116 AD. Cassius Dio under Severus around 229 AD. They wrote for emperors who needed Nero to be a monster. The Flavian dynasty that followed Nero justified their seizure of power by vilifying him. The senatorial class these writers represented had every reason to emphasize his worst acts. So they wrote about matricide, about burning Rome, about persecuting Christians, and about Sporus, the ultimate proof of Nero's depravity. But here's what they buried in careful language. Here's the truth they almost didn't record. This wasn't unique. Roman slavery gave masters absolute power over their slaves' bodies. Sexual access to slaves was assumed, not questioned. Castration of slave boys was illegal for Roman citizens but practiced in the empire's eastern territories. The keeping of young male slaves for sexual purposes was routine among Roman elites. What made Nero's treatment of Sporus shocking to his contemporaries was not the violation itself but the public performance. Elite Romans routinely kept concubines. What they didn't do was marry them in state ceremonies. They didn't parade them as empresses. They didn't demand that senators bow to them. The scandal was not Sporus's suffering but Nero's refusal to hide it. This is the buried truth. The machinery that destroyed Sporus operated throughout the empire for centuries. He was not the only child whose body was used, whose identity was erased, whose voice was silenced. He is simply the one we know about because an emperor made a spectacle of it. Scholar Edward Champlin's 2003 work Nero argues that much of Nero's reputation was constructed after his death. Some historians even question whether the Sporus story was exaggerated or invented. But 3 independent sources confirm the core facts: the castration, the public marriage, the passage between emperors, the suicide. These details appear in texts written decades apart, by authors with different agendas, for different audiences. Coins confirm Nero's deification of Poppaea. The timeline of the year of the 4 emperors is well established. The practice of slave concubinage is documented throughout Roman literature. What Nero did to Sporus was worse than you imagined, not because the acts themselves were unique in Roman history, but because they were enabled by an entire system that treated human beings as property. And that system operated for centuries. Let's talk about the machinery that made this possible. Roman slavery was not marginal but foundational. Scholars estimate 15 to 25% of Roman Italy's population were enslaved. In wealthy urban households, the proportion was higher. Slaves had no legal personhood. They could not own property, marry, or control their own bodies. They existed as living tools, instruments of their master's will. Sexual access to slaves was assumed. The rape of enslaved people was not a crime but an exercise of property rights. Masters who violated their slaves sexually faced no legal consequences whatsoever. This was the legal framework within which Nero operated. When he ordered Sporus castrated, he was exercising his legitimate authority as a slave owner. When he married the boy in public ceremony, he was pushing social boundaries but breaking no laws. Everything he did to Sporus was technically legal under Roman law. What scandalized the senatorial class was not the violation of Sporus's rights. Sporus had no rights, but Nero's public performance of acts that should have remained private. This is what the historians condemn. Not the abuse itself but how Nero flaunted it. Not the suffering of Sporus but the mockery Nero made of Roman dignity. The sources you're hearing quoted, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, were all members of the elite. Their perspective was that of the ruling class, concerned with order, hierarchy, and proper exercise of power. From this perspective, Nero's crime was not cruelty but chaos. He upset the boundaries that separated public from private, legitimate from illegitimate, masculine from feminine. He forced respectable people to participate in degrading spectacles. Sporus's suffering was incidental to their concerns. He mattered to the historical record only as evidence of Nero's madness, not as a person whose pain deserved witness. This is the machinery that destroyed him. Not just Nero's personal cruelty but an entire system that treated human beings as property and gave masters absolute power over those they owned. The law enabled it. Society normalized it. History recorded it without moral outrage. And 2,000 years later, we're still uncovering what that system did to the people it consumed. Sporus died silent. But the machinery that killed him? That's documented in detail, because Rome kept careful records of everything except the suffering of those it destroyed. In the 21st century, we see Sporus differently. We have language for what was done to him that Romans didn't possess. We call it child abuse, sexual slavery, psychological torture, identity erasure. We recognize trauma where ancient writers saw scandal. Modern scholars approach the story with new frameworks. Craig A. Williams in his 1999 work Roman Homosexuality argues this was not about desire but about power's ultimate expression. Nero was demonstrating his ability to reshape reality itself. Some see resistance in Sporus's final act. By choosing death over the spectacle Vitellius planned, he reclaimed agency. His suicide was an act of will in a life defined by the absence of will. Others caution against romanticizing. A 16-year-old choosing death is not triumph but tragedy. His suicide was not freedom but final proof of how completely the system destroyed him. What we can say with certainty is that Sporus suffered. That his suffering was documented by multiple independent sources. That it was enabled by a legal and social system treating human beings as property. The biases in our sources are real. The historians who recorded this had every reason to vilify Nero. They may have exaggerated. They may have embellished. But the core facts remain verified. The castration, the public marriage, the passage between emperors, the suicide, and the silence. The complete absence of Sporus's own voice from the historical record. The erasure that continued after death. The reduction of a person to a symbol, a cautionary tale, proof of someone else's wickedness. That erasure is as much part of the horror as anything Nero did to his body. Here is what we will never know. What Sporus thought when Nero first ordered him castrated. What he felt standing in women's clothing before crowds that stared and whispered. What went through his mind when Nero kissed him publicly, when senators bowed to him, when he was passed like property between emperors. His voice is lost forever. The machinery that destroyed his body also destroyed any chance of hearing his perspective. But you're hearing his story now. 2,000 years after his death, you're witnessing what Rome tried to forget. That has to mean something. If this documentary changed how you see the ancient world, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more buried histories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.